A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Shh, it's the Film Flamers.
Hi, I'm Chris.
Hey everybody, I'm Robert.
And we're the Film Flamers.
And we are continuing our celebration of our 1-year anniversary with the movie Silence of the Lambs. We started this podcast talking about Copycat, which is one of our shared favorite horror movies. And, you know, we love the subgenre of the crime horror film. And we thought we'd bring it home for the 1-year anniversary and talk about the one that sort of started it all in the 90s.
I'm sorry, Robert, but this horror film identifies as a thriller?
Well, I mean, I think in this particular choice...
You need to respect its nouns.
Whatever you want to call it, it's still a horror thriller or something, right? So, Silence of the Lambs is a big deal when it comes to, like, horror crime, especially in the 90s. It started a whole slew of movies that came after it, and we thought we'd spend some time and talk about it.
And all jokes aside, we'll be getting into a lot of the stuff that surrounds this film, including some of the issues surrounding LGBT, especially the T part of the LGBT issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, because back in the 90s, the early 90s, I think that segment of the LGBT umbrella was far underrepresented.
There's a lot to dive into there, and trust us, we'll get there.
Yeah.
Silence of the Lambs is a 1991 American psychological horror thriller film directed by Jonathan Demme, adapted from Thomas Harris's 1988 novel of the same name. The film stars Jodie Foster, Sir Anthony Hopkins, Scott Glenn, Ted Levine, and Darla the Bichon Frise, or Bitch and Frizzy, as we like to call them here, as Precious.
Precious.
The novel was Harris's first to feature Clarice Starling and the second to feature Hannibal Lecter, and was the second adaptation of Harris's novel to feature Lecter, preceded by the Michael Mann-directed Manhunter back in 1986, based on his novel Red Dragon, also a film later made with Ralph Fiennes. The film's score was composed by Howard Shore.
I love that score so much. It's regularly cited by critics, film directors, and audiences alike as one of the greatest and most influential films of all time. A sequel titled Hannibal was released in 2001, in which Hopkins reprised his role. It was followed by 2 prequels, Red Dragon from 2002 and Hannibal Rising from 2007.
I never watched that one.
I haven't seen it either, actually, so...
I don't think Anthony Hopkins was in that.
He's not. He's sort of a younger child in that movie.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so maybe that's one to revisit later, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of these sequels and remakes later on. But for now, without further ado, this is The Silence of the Lambs.
You spook easily, Starling?
Not yet, sir.
He's past the others. The last cell. I'll be watching. You'll do fine.
A killer is on the loose.
Keeps them alive for 3 days. Then he shoots them, skins them, and dumps them.
A rookie FBI agent is on his trail.
He's got real physical strength, cautious, precise, and he's never impulsive. He'll never stop.
But in order to track him down, she'll have to match wits.
I'll help you catch him, Clarice.
Believe me, you don't want Hannibal Lecter inside your head.
With the darkest of all minds.
Just do your job, but never forget what he is.
But he's a monster. Pure psychopath. So rare to capture one alive.
So close to the way you're going to catch him. Do you realize that? Oh, Clarice, your problem is you need to get more fun out of life.
You told me you don't spook easily.
You call this easy, sir?
Lecter's missing hand arm.
Man's a raving maniac. Who knows what he'll do?
Thank you, Clarice. Thank you.
A rookie FBI detective with childhood trauma tries to imprison a misunderstood trans dog lover by routinely harassing a famous chef.
What?
It's true if you think about it.
I mean, that's the most concise plot line of this movie I've ever heard in my life. Is that the real one?
No.
Let me hear it.
FBI trainee Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, is pulled from her training at the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, by Jack Crawford, played by Scott Glenn, of the Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit. He assigns her to interview Hannibal Lecter, a former psychiatrist and incarcerated cannibalistic serial killer, played by Anthony Hopkins, whose insight might prove useful in the pursuit of a psychopathic killer nicknamed Buffalo Bill, who kills young women and then removes the skin from their bodies, played by Ted Levine. Clarice travels to the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where she's led by the head of the hospital and full-time creep, Dr. Chilton, to Hannibal's solitary quarters. Although initially pleasant and courteous, Hannibal grows impatient with Clarice's attempts at dissecting him and rebuffs her. As she's leaving, one of the prisoners flicks man chowder at her.
What gave her the red-eye surprise?
Yeah. Hannibal, who considers this act unspeakably ugly, calls Clarice back to his cell and tells her to seek out an old patient of his. This leads her to a storage shed, where she discovers a man's severed head with a sphinx moth lodged in its throat. She returns to Hannibal, who tells her that this man is linked to Buffalo Bill. He offers to profile Buffalo Bill on the condition that he may be transferred away from Dr. Chilton, who he detests. Meanwhile, Buffalo Bill abducts a senator's daughter, Catherine Martin. Crawford authorizes Clarice to offer Hannibal a fake deal, promising a prison transfer if he provides information that helps them find Buffalo Bill and rescue Catherine. Instead, Hannibal demands a quid pro quo from Clarice, offering clues about Buffalo Bill in exchange for personal information from her childhood. Clarice tells Hannibal about the murder of her father when she was 10 years old. Meanwhile, Dr. Chilton secretly records the conversation and reveals Clarice's deceit to Hannibal before offering him a deal of his own. Hannibal agrees and is flown to Memphis, where he verbally torments Senator Ruth Martin, the mother of the kidnapped Catherine, and gives her misleading information on Buffalo Bill, including the name Louis Friend. Clarice notices that Louis Friend is actually an anagram of iron sulfide, or fool's gold. She visits Hannibal, who is now being held in a cage-like cell in a Tennessee courthouse, and asks for the truth. Hannibal tells her that all of the information she needs is contained in the case file. Rather than give her the real name, he insists that they continue their quid pro quo, and she recounts a traumatic childhood incident where she was awakened by the sound of spring lambs being slaughtered on a relative's farm in Montana. Clarice admits that she still sometimes wakes thinking she can hear the lambs screaming, and Hannibal speculates that she is motivated to save Catherine in the hope that it will end the nightmares. Hannibal gives her back the case files on Buffalo Bill after their conversation is interrupted by Dr. Chilton and the police, who escort her from the building. Later that evening, in a bloody and elaborate ruse, Hannibal kills his guards, escapes from his cell, and disappears into the night. Later, Clarice analyzes Hannibal's annotations in the case files and realizes that Buffalo Bill must have known his first victim personally. Clarice travels to the victim's hometown and discovers that Buffalo Bill was a tailor, with dresses and dress patterns identical to the patches of skin removed from each of his victims. She telephones Crawford to inform him that Buffalo Bill is trying to form a woman's suit out of real skin, but Crawford is already en route to make an arrest, having cross-referenced Hannibal's notes with hospital archives and finding a transsexual woman named Jane Gum, who once applied unsuccessfully for a sex change operation. Clarice continues interviewing friends of Buffalo Bill's first victim in Ohio, while Crawford leads an FBI HRT team to Gum's address in Illinois, which turns out to be empty. Meanwhile, Clarice is led to the house of a Jack Gordon, who she realizes is actually Jane Gum after seeing a large moth land on sewing equipment inside his house. She pursues him down into his multi-room basement, where she discovers that Catherine is still alive but trapped in a dry well. After turning off the basement lights, Gum stalks Clarice in the dark with night vision goggles, but gives his position away when he cocks his gun. Clarice reacts just in time and fires all of her rounds, killing Gum. Sometime later, at the FBI Academy graduation party, Clarice receives a phone call from Hannibal, who is at an airport in Bimini. He assures her that he does not plan to pursue her, and asks her to return the favor, which she says she can't promise to do. Hannibal then hangs up the phone, saying that he is having an old friend for dinner, and starts following a newly arrived Dr. Chilton before disappearing into the crowd.
The end. The Silence of the Lambs was released on February the 14th, Valentine's Day, 1991, and grossed $272 million worldwide against its $19 million budget, becoming the fifth highest grossing movie of 1991 worldwide.
Damn.
That's a lot.
It was still a sleeper hit, though.
That's right. I mean, there was tons of word of mouth for this movie, which is amazing. Although I think its opening weekend had quite a bit of, like, drawing power to it.
Sure.
Because the book was so well regarded by the time that the movie was released. So that played a huge part into it.
Yeah.
Critically acclaimed upon its release, it became only the third film, the other two being It Happened One Night and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, to win Academy Awards in all top 5 categories, which are Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay, in this case, adapted. It's also the first and so far only Best Picture winner widely considered to be a horror film, and one of the only 4 such films to be nominated in the category, along with The Exorcist, Jaws, and Get Out.
So that's really surprising to me. Now, what's really surprising to me is that Anthony Hopkins won Best Actor to this, because I would have, especially given his screen time, which is like a legendarily 16 minutes or so, right? Although I've seen different numbers on that.
Yeah, I think I've seen it so far as they said like 24 to 25 minutes of screen time. Either way, it's incredibly low.
Everywhere on the internet, they're saying 16 minutes, whatever, but on IMDb, they say it's actually the second shortest. But I would have really thought that they would have given him a supporting actor, given the nature of the role as well.
And I would agree too. I think that when people saw this movie, though, they tend to think of Hannibal Lecter as one of the main characters of this film, and it'd be really disserving to that character after so many people had seen it and loved it to call him a supporting role, right? Because he really does like push the story forward in such a way. I do want to bring up, when we're talking about awards, though, that this movie like famously lost so many Golden Globes right before the Oscars. In the Globes, it was nominated for Best Actress, which it won. It was also nominated for Best Picture, Director, Actor, and Screenplay, and lost all of those.
So it was not expected to win.
Exactly.
It was kind of an upset, especially considering Ridley Scott's Thelma and Louise, which was really, I think, considered a big contender for all of these wins.
Agreed.
If you ever wanted to blame something for Thelma and Louise not winning all of the awards, this is the film to blame. Sorry, Ridley Scott, you just can't win. He did, but he was nominated, of course, for Thelma and Louise, Gladiator, Black Hawk Down, and then later, just recently, The Martian.
That's right. Which is a really good movie. I love that movie quite a bit. At the Oscars, like we said, it won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor and Actress, and Screenplay. It was also nominated for Best Sound, which it didn't win, obviously, and Editing. In my opinion, I think it could have garnered a lot more nominations than this, and we'll get into that later on in the discussion. It was nominated for 9 BAFTA awards. It only won 2 of them, both for the acting nominations. And for those of you who may not consider this movie to be a horror film, I just want to throw in that it was nominated for several Fangoria Chainsaw Awards, and it won many, many of them. So, I mean, how's that for, like, throwing it in the horror ghetto?
Were the Saturn Awards around back then?
Yes, it was also nominated for many Saturn Awards as well.
Back then, did they section between horror and thriller?
No, they didn't. They called it a horror film.
There we go. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Currently, Silence of the Lambs holds a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, with a consensus that reads, Director Jonathan Demme's smart, taut thriller teeters on the edge between psychological study and all-out horror, and benefits greatly from stellar performances by Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster.
In 2018, Empire ranked it number 48th on their list of the 500 greatest movies of all time.
And this is all over the AFI ranks as well. I mean, it's the 5th greatest and most influential thriller film of all time on their lists, while the character of Clarice Starling was rated as the 6th greatest hero and Hannibal Lecter as the number 1 greatest villain in film.
I think it's also safe to say that she was the highest ranking woman on that list of heroes.
She was.
Yeah. The film was considered culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the U.S. Library of Congress and was selected to be preserved in the National Film Registry in 2011.
Which is a really, really high honor, honestly.
It is. I know. I think we've said that on previous previous movies we talked about, things like Rosemary's Baby, you know, but these are the movies that really stand the test of time.
Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, and the things that we would call like classic American film or pieces of American art. And that is a huge, huge honor. There's a lot to talk about when we start talking about Silence of the Lambs, I think. And it's kind of hard to put it in a certain order, you know? So I think maybe we should talk about like the actual technical achievements of this film and then sort of move on into its more cultural significance.
To me, there was almost nothing special about how this was filmed. I mean, there were certain things that they did methodically, very well planned to give the audience certain feelings, like where Jodie Foster would look off camera, you know, for certain scenes to make the audience have more of her perspective versus looking into camera. They had Hannibal do, Anthony Hopkins, look in the camera to give the sense that he knows everything, right? And so they do different things like that, but in a way, I was thinking while I was watching this latest time that Silence of the Lambs is just a really good example of something that's competently directed, competently acted with really, really good material, right? The material here is what makes this movie so good.
And I agree. And I mean, so like Ted Talley, who wrote the screenplay, read the novel. So he was friends with Thomas Harris, who's famously private as an author. Like he doesn't like to go out there publicly. He doesn't give a lot of interviews and things like that. But he happened to be a patron of the gallery that Ted Talley's wife owned. And he was talking to Thomas Harris about his previous work. And he was like, "Oh, I'm writing this book. Do you want an advance copy?" And he sent it to him. And Ted Talley was like, he loved it. He loved it so much, and he wanted to write this movie. Mm-hmm. By the time he got around to sort of propositioning himself or like campaigning for that role of screenwriter, it had already been picked up, and he really had to go and fight to write this film. And he loved the material so much, and it shows in the screenplay and the way that the movie is made. And I think that he had a hand on set all the time in a way that screenwriters don't always get to do. You know?
Well, so I was thinking about the script and this dialogue, and I don't think there's any other movie where I'm hanging on every word that these characters say in these scenes, especially between Clarice and Hannibal Lecter, right? Their dialogue is so smart and back and forth, and it's just especially Hannibal Lecter's. I almost can't think of any other film where I'm hanging on each line of dialogue unless I'm thinking about something like The Lion in Winter, which is, of course, Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole, you know? So that tells you how elevated the script is as far as how interesting and intriguing and smart it is.
Agreed. I mean, like, I love the screenplay for this movie. I think that at the end of the day, it's sort of like this like crime noir, but it takes it into so many different places, right? We just had a conversation about Seven, and where we talked about like how basic that was as far as like crime noir goes. And, you know, it made some changes throughout it, but Silence of the Lambs really changes the game when it comes to that particular like subgenre of film. And I mean, just have to applaud the actors for this, because I think that I feel that they read this screenplay and there wasn't a whole lot of changing of what was written. You know, they took the words and they adapted their characters so very well. When you're talking about those close-up shots of Hannibal Lecter, right? That movie does it a lot. I think there's lots of close-ups of the men talking to Clarice in this movie. Like, they do a lot of close-ups of Scott Glenn. They do close-ups of Ted Levine. They do close-ups of every man who's even Barney, you know?
Well, for Clarice's monologue, they certainly pushed in on her face while she was talking about the lambs screaming, right? So they actually do that, and it's fairly common in a dialogue, a very, very focused dialogue, to slowly kind of zoom into each person's face back and forth, because it's almost full body shots at first, you know, where he's in Memphis, right? And they're talking outside the cage, and it starts off almost full body shots, and then it just goes closer and closer to each one of their faces as the dialogue continues. And that's one way to zoom the audience in and make it even more immersive in the performances. And that's another thing. I mean, I can talk about the material all day about this film, but it is Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster's performances that really, really make this magic, right? I can't almost imagine anyone else selling Hannibal Lecter in this performance like Anthony Hopkins did.
And Anthony Hopkins was no stranger to horror roles, you know, even before this and certainly after it.
And this was kind of his last-ditch effort to succeed in Hollywood.
Yeah, and I had heard that before. I think that he tried. I know, like, early on, he did, like, Audrey Rose and Magic were two, like, early horror films
He was going to leave America, and he was going to go just focus solely on the stage.
And then after Silence of the Lambs, he got just a slew of roles. I mean, this is one of those times where, like, the Academy Award curse, like, did not happen, you know? Like, he won the Academy Award. He got nominated a couple times afterward. But, I mean, aside from some of the, like, the high British period pieces he made a lot of horror and horror-adjacent movies afterward. Things like Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? The Edge, which I consider to be quite horror-adjacent.
Oh, that's a great movie.
Mm-hmm. Hearts in Atlantis is a Stephen King adaptation. He was in The Wolfman.
Well, now he's in Westworld.
That's right.
And he's an amazing...
And he played Hitchcock, you know, later on. So, I mean, like, I think he really took this role.
And Nixon, and that was really scary.
I forgot he was in Nixon.
Yeah.
Joan Allen was good in that movie, too.
He was nominated.
He was. Yeah. That was a good movie. He's a fantastic actor. And it sort of, like, bums me out to think that he was trying to work for so long and not being recognized for everything.
Well,
right?
I think it was karma because he lucked out with his first movie. His first movie was The Lion in Winter.
You're right.
Very first. Mm-hmm. And he got a lot of advice from Katharine Hepburn on how to act for film. And that's a really incredible story. And
that kind of shows a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, like, he has kind of a Katharine Hepburn cadence.
That's funny that you say that because he said that he pulled two people as influences on his voice for Hannibal.
Okay.
And that was Truman Capote and that was Katharine Hepburn.
I can totally see the Katharine Hepburn, like, all over it, you know?
That kind of a nasal Clarice.
Yeah. Yes.
That's totally Katharine Hepburn.
I love it. Jodie Foster herself is no, like, stranger to good roles either. Like, she had previously won Best Actress for The Accused. I think it was, like, back in, like, 89 or something like that when that came out, where she played some sort of, like, really unsympathetic rape victim, right? And she's fantastic in that role. And I think after she won that Oscar, she went to campaign for things that she wanted to do. And I think that Jodie Foster really had her eyes set on a grander role in filmmaking, because I think that she agreed to do movies so she could also become a director later on in life, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, like, both of them are, like, trained actors, and they knew how to dive into a character, and it just shows on the screen.
Well, she campaigned hard for this role, and they went after several actresses first who declined it, and we'll go into that later because that's part of my fun facts section.
Those are always my favorite. I cannot wait to hear that shit.
But yeah, so she finally got it just because of her passion for the project.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan Demme was the director of this movie, and he studied under Roger Corman, right? So in his early years of filmmaking, he did a lot of these exploitation films that Corman was making. And I think you cannot work under Roger Corman and not learn how to make a movie very quickly, very cheaply, and, you know, as good as possible, right?
Yeah.
You make the movie for what you got, you do it as best you can. But he did movies like Something Wild and Married to the Mob before that. And after Silence of the Lambs, he went on to do things like Philadelphia, Beloved, which we have famously made fun of on this podcast, I think, a couple times, right? But I think we still like that movie. So, I mean, he's no slouch when it comes to directing. He knows what he's doing, and he knows how to work a camera and to work a cast. And so this is just one of those times that everything is kismet to me. Like, you get the right people at the right time on the right movie, and it just all falls into place. I talk about, like, my running top 5 movies of all time, right? And it hasn't changed since, like, the early 2000s. And Silence of the Lambs is always, like, right there at number 6. And I don't know why it doesn't creep into it, because it really is almost a perfect movie. Like, the cinematography in this film by Taka Fujimoto is amazing to me. I'm not the biggest fan of horror scores, but if you recall back to our top 10, I listed this one from Howard Shore.
Well, Howard Shore was trying to make an invisible score too.
And it works.
And yeah, he was trying to make it non-noticeable, but there's still a theme there, which I like.
Oh, yeah.
But it's compared to some of Howard Shore's other work, like Lord of the Rings, where it's much, much more thematic and bombastic. right? So he's capable of a huge range of music, which I've always loved about Howard Shore.
And comparatively, this one is very quiet. There's lots of like growing strings and things like that. And it's really like good, almost like Hitchcockian score, you know? Yeah. And so it's like Bernard Herrmann-esque, you know? And I mean, I like that. It's very string heavy and it really fits the background so much, you know, and I rarely ever say that about scores, and this is just one of my favorites. I know when I lived in New York, I used to have to walk for blocks and blocks to get to subway stations, sometimes very late at night. I worked at a video store and I had to close it sometimes. And so it's like 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm walking through New York, and this is one of the staples that I listened to all the time was that opening scene from Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
And like clearly, no wonder I was so scared sometimes walking around, because I'm like, listen to this tense ass music in the dark to a quiet subway station. You know, it's a really effective score.
It is. And actually, I really like the score, and it's super effective, and it matches the DNA of this film really, really well. It's a match made in heaven. If I'm going to like take scores to listen to, this is not really one of them outside of that opening track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I was going to listen to any kind of thriller that's similar to Silence of the Lambs, I still prefer the score to Copycat.
Which is also really good.
Yeah.
Was it Young, right?
Christopher Young.
Yeah. It's also fun to note that Jonathan Demme owes a debt of gratitude to Roger Corman for sure. He pops up in this movie as like the head of the FBI, and it's one of those really fun cameos. And for this rewatch, I think I last rewatched Silence of the Lambs maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, and it was right near Halloween, and my husband does not like horror movies, but he will watch Silence of the Lambs. So we did a Manhunter, Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal like marathon. Mm-hmm. And I totally forgot that Roger Corman was in this movie. And so when his name popped up in the credits, I was just like, oh my God, I forgot that Roger Corman was in this. And he is briefly, you know? Mm-hmm. And it just goes to show you that, I mean, these directors who come up through the system and like learn their craft, they always go back and like show their appreciation for the people who taught them what to do and where they came from.
Yeah.
I think this movie is incredibly well choreographed, right? And I don't really say that very often about films.
You mean like the blocking?
Yes. Right. So, I mean, not so much like for the actors. I think that just like this movie does a really good job of like knowing, I guess it is blocking too. You can do that for other things like cop cars. You know that scene where Hannibal Lecter is flying into Memphis, right? And it cuts directly to that hangar where the plane has landed. And these two lines of cop cars are sort of like joining together.
No, they have a lot of great set pieces.
Yes. My gosh. And it goes to show you too, like we were talking about like Kismet and having the right people at the right time. And like, I'm not even quite sure in filmmaking who sets those sort of things up. Is it a director, or is it the cinematographer who sets those things up like that?
There's a lot. There can be, the director has a lot. The cinematographer can, the DP, obviously, the director of photography. You know, the set, you know, the dressers, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of people. And of course that comes from material as well. So it's just it's kind of a perfect storm of a lot of different people's input.
And it becomes really iconic too, especially when it comes to like costumes, I think. Like Colleen Atwood did this, and you know, that face piece that Hannibal Lecter wears when he's being escorted off that plane, or when he's in his like cell with Chilton and Barney standing right beside him, right? Just the choices they made make it seem so much more scary.
And that's actually a good example because like Anthony Hopkins really kind of went to Jonathan Demme and they were like, why doesn't he wear white in this end scene, right? Like in the cage, because they were going to have him be in the orange jumpsuit, you know, and all of that. Mm-hmm. And they just thought it looked much more gothic and psychiatric and horror-esque in a way, demonic, with him wearing completely white in those ending scenes. And I thought that was great, especially because it pops the blood really well.
It really does. I mean, so if you're trying to like have to showcase the red of the blood against white, that's great. And white's kind of scary anyway. You know, if you see someone just completely in white, it can call back fears of like the medical industry or whatever, you know?
Well, yeah. And not in every culture, black is death and white is life, right?
Yeah.
In other cultures, white is the color for death, etc., right?
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
This movie is kind of famously decried as not a horror film. And I'm not quite sure why, because I think it has tons and tons of elements of horror in it.
It's really interesting because you'll ask, this is like one of the main movies that you can bring up to people that when they say they don't like horror movies, and you say, it's just like my go-to. And I think it's Matt's go-to when he has this conversation. He has a lot more conversation about it than I do.
Yeah.
And like he'll meet people at his work and they'll talk about movies and they'll say, oh, I hate horror movies. And he says, well, do you like Silence of the Lambs? And like, well, that's not really a horror movie. Right? So it's, again, that horror movie ghetto that people just think that it has to be a shitty crap like B movie, or they just don't like to be scared. But you don't have to be scared in a horror movie, right? Mm-hmm. It's a whole all-encompassing genre in a way, right? As far as the macabre and dealing with kind of the dark nature of humanity in a way. So to me, like just we were talking about earlier, the Saturn Awards didn't used to differentiate between horror and thriller. Now they do. So that's really interesting because I feel like there was this push in the late 80s and early 90s to differentiate thrillers from horror so that they could do these films and not be like lumped into that category, that psychological category that people have for horror a lot of the time, which is, it's really a shame because they're missing out on a lot of great movies. A lot of people wouldn't think of Jurassic Park or even Jaws as a horror movie, but those are, in a way.
And this is a good conversation for us to have later on, I think, too.
Yeah, we're going to have a whole Patreon episode about the genre of horror and all of its little Venn diagrams into other genres.
Because here at the Film Flamers, we talk about horror adjacency quite a bit. The last couple of movies that we've covered have been, what people would consider to be horror adjacent. And I think that this is like the number one horror adjacent movie. I have no problems calling it a horror film, which I'm sure we'll get into later on. But I was reading an article from 2016 around the anniversary of the release of this movie, and they were interviewing Ted Talley, the screenwriter. And he was asked, how do you feel about people describing Silence of the Lambs as a horror movie, right? And he says, it's been embraced over the years by the horror community, which is fine with me. They like to say it's the only horror movie to ever win Best Picture, but I always think of it as a detective movie or a thriller. I have nothing against horror movies, but to me, horror movies involve the supernatural. Lecter may border on supernatural, but he's not. And I could not disagree more with the screenwriter's comments of his own movie. I mean,
yeah, there's supernatural horror, but then you have what I feel like what most people identify as the horror ghetto as, like the My Bloody Valentines, the horror schlock, right?
Right.
Those B movies. And so it's just way more than that. And it's still great to like those movies too.
And this movie, why it does not have the kind of level of violence that you would expect from a slasher movie per se, right? There's lots of really uncomfortable gore that's just shown after the fact or post-mortem on victims, right? Mm-hmm. There's lots of really shocking moments that one would consider this to be horrific. And I don't think it's safe to discount it. And I certainly don't think it's safe to discount the entire horror genre as something that's only supernatural, quote unquote. But I mean, hey, that's what he said. It's what he thinks. Mm-hmm. I would think that most people disagree with that wholeheartedly. So we've talked about before in this podcast, especially last month's Top 10, where we were talking about psycho killers, how Buffalo Bill, a.k.a. James Gumb, is sort of like an amalgam of serial killers that Thomas Harris sort of based that character on.
Yet again, Ed Gein, yeah.
Yeah, Ed Gein. And I think there's some places in this movie where you see lots of Ted Bundy, right? Especially when he's trying to push that couch into the back when he catches Catherine Martin for the first time. And that's something that Ted Bundy did. So they sort of create this character. But in the novel, this character is a transsexual or thinks he is or wants to be. I think that you can sort of gauge him on, the levels of transsexualism or whatnot. I think he's an effective villain, right? But a lot of people sort of decried him as maybe anti-trans or anti-LGBT. At the time, I think in 1991, they wouldn't even use the term LGBT, right?
Yeah. On its release, The Silence of the Lambs was criticized by members of the LGBT community, even though, like you said, they weren't really called that back then as much, for its portrayal of Buffalo Bill as bisexual and transsexual. In response to the critics, Jonathan Demme replied that Buffalo Bill wasn't a gay character. He was a tormented man who hated himself and wished he was a woman because that would have made him as far away from himself as he could possibly be. which I think is bullshit.
Yeah,
He's
I agree.
obviously, at the very least, bisexual.
Well, don't they doesn't Hannibal make an inference to him like having a male lover at some point, right?
Yeah, it's in the story. Like they were lovers. Demi added that he came to realize that there was a tremendous absence of positive gay characters in movies, but a lot of the criticism was directed towards Foster, who the critics alleged was herself a lesbian, which we know to be true now.
Yes.
But a lot of this stuff ties to the concept of autogynephilia. This is basically a theory that came out around the same time as the book and the movie, earlier in the movie, but around the same time as the book. This is Ray Blanchard's autogynephilia theory, which is a psychological typology of male to female transsexualism created by Blanchard through the 80s and 90s, building on the work of his colleague Kurt Freund. Blanchard divided trans women into two groups. One was your homosexual transsexuals, what are now otherwise termed the heterosexual trans women, who, Blanchard says, seek sex reassignment surgery because they are feminine in both behavior and appearance, and to romantically and sexually attract, ideally, heterosexual men. Now, his other is the autogynephilic transsexuals, who, according to Blanchard, are sexually aroused by the idea of having a female body. Blanchard's model is unusual in that neither group is actually considered false transsexuals. Both autogynephilic and homosexual transsexuals are thought to benefit from that transition, but this distinction is a recurring theme in scholarly literature on transsexualism itself. So Blanchard's theory has done nothing for the transgender community or the LGBT community at large. At worst, it's damaged the public's view of transgender people as menaces to society or even dangerous. The trope that this theory helped to create has a name. And this is from, you can look this up on TV Tropes, is called Creepy Crossdresser. Film is not the worst offender. It's just a really obvious one. In this defense, both the novel and the movie go out of their way to tell audiences that being a transsexual in and of itself is not connected to violence. Specifically, Clarice says, and Hannibal agrees, that Bill can't be a transsexual because transsexuals are not innately violent. According to Hannibal, Bill only thinks he's a transsexual due to his quote-unquote hatred of his own identity. This reflects the fair for its day but out-of-date psychology that the book and film relied on. At the time, transsexuality was actually conflated with cross-dressing, and it was thought to be like a mental disorder, along with, of course, being gay earlier than that, and probably around the same time, albeit a benign one, which is kind of the point here. No records or proven cases indicated then or now that transsexuality ever predisposed a person to violence, and so Bill is dismissed as not being a true transsexual. Nowadays, a distinction is drawn between transvestism or cross-dressing and being transgender, or for you newbies, having a gender identity which doesn't align with the one assigned at birth. Neither of these, in and of themselves, can cause or prevent someone to become a homicidal maniac. More specifically, Bill, or Buffalo Bill, is shown to be sexually aroused by the idea of himself as a woman, which is itself also an outdated concept created to hand-wave trans women who are not attracted to men as not being true trans women. The film was heavily criticized in the trans community for portraying a transgender individual as a violent psychopath and for its implications that Bill was turned down for surgery because he was too big and masculine to pass for a woman. The film left out a scene that actually, from the book, that clarified Bill was declined due to his psych assessment because he had already murdered his grandparents and spent time in juvenile detention for the crime. In each movie we watch where like a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans person is stereotypically killed off or victimized or seen to be mentally ill or a murderess due to, at least in part, because of their otherness, I feel like we defend the films based on their own individual and unique context. But the problem here is that if we zoom out to view all of these films together, there's a pattern that's informing society of what an LGBT person is. This is... oh shit, I'm going to say the word.
What?
Problematic. So my Jerry Springer final thought is that we can enjoy these films, but we've got to call these tropes out whenever we see them. So if nothing else, people can better be informed about, and have healthier and realistic views of the LGBT community at large.
And that's true. I know that this is nothing new when it comes to horror. There has been many issues of like transgender people being murderous or, evil in movies, things like Freebie and the Bean or Dressed to Kill, right? I think that Silence of the Lambs took it a step further and it really made the character who he was because he was transgendered or thought he was transgendered. However, at the end of the day, I don't think that the movie portrays him as being evil because he's transgendered.
It's
right?
a mirror of the society's view, right? And like you could even see that with like Sleepaway Camp. It's definitely shown that it's either because of this or that it certainly doesn't help. And they're already well on their way to mental disorder, and psychopathy, right?
Right.
So, like I said, like each of these films kind of explains it within their own little universe. And like this one, they actually have lines in there that kind of shield them a little bit from that by saying transsexuals aren't violent, But at the same time, it's kind of that hand wave, right? It's like, if you zoom out and you look at the pattern amongst all these different films, it's happening, it's happened again and again and again and again, where the gay person or the bi person or the trans person is insane somehow.
Right.
Fucking Norman Bates, the very original,
You're right.
Sleepaway Camp, this one. I mean, you have basically all of the stereotypes and tropes surrounding gay people that help to inform a society at large, which is why it keeps happening. People keep writing these things into their films because that's how people expect it to be. And so we have to call those out as patterns versus hating individual films, I think.
Well, yeah, because, for a long period of time, if you were to see a gay character in film, it was either as some sort of like comedic relief, right? Or a murderous villain, or somebody who's, sadly dying of a disease, which Demi did later on. Yeah. And so, he was decried for this movie when it came out. You already talked about protests and things like that, after the movie's release. And people were protesting the Oscars that year. And they knew it was going to happen. And I think that people were sort of like floundering to sort of, correct a mistake after it had been made or whatever. And that's the reason why they were wearing red ribbons that year for like AIDS, the AIDS crisis. And Orion was trying to give out free copies of the movie for like AIDS benefits and things like that. And I was just like, well, if people are already protesting, you probably don't want to do that. Just like do what you can. And Demi has gone on record and talked about, either the protests or his, being called out for his treatment of like homosexuals in the movie. I was reading an article on slate.com, and they quoted him as saying that we knew it was tremendously important to not have James Gunn misinterpreted by the audience as being homosexual. That would be a complete betrayal of the themes of the movie and a disservice to gay people. He went on to describe the killer as someone who was completely horrified at who he was, and that his desperation to become something completely other is manifested in his ill-guided attempts at transvestitism. And his behavior and mannerisms can be interpreted as gay, right? And that's not what he wanted to do. He later on said that he felt that he did a disservice to these gay people, and he should have done a better job as a director to show that one particular character's motivations as opposed to sort of like grouping it into something entirely different.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's something that people have, back to that, autogynephilia argument, that's something that trans people had to fight. They're not sexually aroused. The vast, vast, vast majority of them are not sexually aroused by being a female, anywhere that I am sexually aroused by being a man, versus, sexuality is generally, outward. Right. And that's the same thing for trans people. They just happen to identify with another gender. So it's just something that, yet one more thing they have to deal with when people are thinking about them as a mental disorder or something, misunderstanding the nature of this. It's really simpler than that.
Yeah, and I agree. And I know that moving forward, we're going to make better choices in film, hopefully, about how people are represented, and we already talked about like being able to appreciate a movie, even though it's looked back on in the past as being bad for that particular group of people. When I watch this movie, I don't think that his motives fall within anything trans. I think that he was a person that was already well on his way to being murderous, right? And I know,
but at the same time, it's great in this film. Everything works. I love this movie.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, who's the most famous trans person in film? Probably this person.
Probably.
That's not great.
Yeah. No, you're right. So that scene in Silence of the Lambs, the famous scene where Bill's doing his like naked dance, right? Where he sort of like, tucks his genitals behind himself and stands there in a certain way. Mm-hmm. I mean, for 1991, or even by today's standards, be seen as something shocking to see in film, you know? And I think that does create a really bad picture of what people are as transgendered. Or...
Well, yeah. And even, okay, so what is basically, so this is what happens when you essentially don't let someone transition. That's another kind of argument that the film might be portraying.
Okay.
And the sad reality is that when people aren't able to have access to these essentially transformations, if they can't do it themselves, a lot of the time they're not hurting other people. They're killing themselves, which is horrible. And so if anything, we need to shine a light on that, right?
Yeah, that's true. Do you think that, today, transgender people are getting a lot more notoriety, and we're starting to learn more about, that culture of people, or what these people are going through in their personal lives. Do you think that we wouldn't have the kind of attitude that we have today, or a growing acceptance of it, without something as,
who can know?
Silence of the Lambs?
Yeah, I don't know. I know that it certainly did nothing good, but at least now it's a conversation starter. Yeah. And I think the general world at large is starting to learn healthier attitudes towards trans people.
Agreed. I think another thing that this movie does really well is sort of this like pre-Me Too movement, right? Or like to me, this movie is really, really feminist, right? And I'm not sure if they tried to do it that way, but I think that they bring up their feminism in ways because it makes people uncomfortable watching it, right? I think there's a lot of gays going to Clarice, right? There are guys who turn around and watch her run in the other direction, like check out her ass or something like that. She walks into an elevator full of men and they all just stare at her constantly. Or she walks into that mortuary and all the male cops are just looking at her right in the face, or in our particular instance, the camera, right? And it really created a sense of like uncomfortability at being a woman. It makes you really identify with that particular character.
Oh no, they did a good job of problematizing all of that, right? As far as seeing the stares that she was getting, the judgments that she was getting, the guy using sexism to kind of get his way, even though he's using it kind of ironically, like her boss or whatever.
Oh yeah, and she calls him out on that, right, in the car.
He asked her, how she felt about that, and she's like, they're going to look for you for an example, and he says, note taken. But yeah, it's a constant reminder throughout the film of basically the sexist world that she lives in, and it's good that the film problematizes that. Yes, right? It's not just the world she lives in. There's a judgment on it.
Mm-hmm. And so, I really...
Even Hannibal.
Yes.
You would say, if you look at the novels and everything else, who does he kill? If he's a serial killer, who does he kill? And I think the quote is that the serially rude is who he kills.
Yeah, eat the rude.
And just through the power of his voice and his monologuing, he somehow killed... his roommate in the jail or whatever, in a different cell or whatever, just by talking to him. Yeah. Made him kill himself.
He did.
Because of what he flicked on.
Well, that man chowder is that we called it earlier? Oh my God. I hate that quote too. And he's like, I can smell your cunt or whatever. I can't even say it. It makes me gag.
And then she has to repeat it.
Yeah. And he reminds her too, because he was talking about that scene about coveting, right? And he just, to me, in this movie, Clarice Starling is constantly being reminded that she's a woman. She's constantly being like, be careful, this may be scary for you, or, and we're proud of you for trying to do what you're doing, but let me just build up for you what could happen, and she's constantly being warned about things. And even from Lecter, he does that. He talks about coveting, and he was just like, how do we begin to covet? Do we covet what we see every day, right? And he's like, can't you feel the eyes on you? Can't you feel people watching your body all the time, and don't your eyes move to what you want, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a constant reminder of the sexism that she's faced day in and day out in this job. And she was just a student at that point. So I think we learn later on in some of the sequels of Silence of the Lambs exactly who she becomes, right? And I think this is a good time to talk about the main sequel of Silence of the Lambs, which is Hannibal from 2001, I think is when it came out, right?
I liked parts of that film.
Yeah, I did too. I liked the film a lot more than I liked the book, right?
Yeah, but I just feel like that performance that Anthony Hopkins gives as Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, starts transitioning over into just Anthony Hopkins being Anthony Hopkins in these sequels. And that's not something I enjoy as much.
I will applaud someone who like feels at home, you know, with a character enough to like continue doing it. And I think that's great. What's sorely missed in that particular sequel, I think, is Jodie Foster. I think Jodie Foster's performances.
Yes. Yep. I really wish I knew. Do you know why she didn't show up?
She was just doing other things at that time, you know, and I mean, she had moved on and she was doing a lot more directing and producing. And I mean, I think we even see today, like Jodie Foster doesn't show up in movies a lot.
No, it just pisses me off that I felt like that role really gave her a lot in her career. And Anthony Hopkins came back. It's like, go back. Like, why couldn't you just do it? Or why couldn't they wait for her if she couldn't? I'm sure they tried to wait for her.
I mean, I hope so. I know that Ted Talley wanted to do a sequel to Silence of the Lambs immediately afterward. I think a lot of people did because it made a lot of money. It won a lot of Oscars, right? And they were ready for a sequel, but they were giving Thomas Harris the time to create a novel first. And that's the novel that he came out with. And Ted Talley has go on record as saying that he didn't want to make it the sequel to Hannibal. He said, no, I'm not writing the screenplay. I don't want anything to do with it, because he didn't like the direction that Thomas Harris took with that character of Clarice. Because Clarice is sort of drawn to Lecter in that book, in that movie, in a way that he felt wasn't organic to that particular character. He didn't think that they had that kind of like loving relationship, you know? I think Hannibal sort of feels that he is more in love with Clarice than Clarice is with him. I think you see that with that slight finger touch in the cell when he's giving that dossier back to her, you know? But the movie Hannibal and the novel sort of like creates this weird obsession with each other that I don't quite buy, you know? And that's, to me, where that particular movie fails.
So I've got some fun facts. The first choice for the role of Clarice Starling was Michelle Pfeiffer.
I can totally see that.
Who turned it down to being nervous about the subject matter. The second choice, Meg Ryan, also turned down the role for the same reasons. Demi then tried to get Laura Dern, who I think would have been great.
Oh, yeah.
But the studio rejected her as they thought she wasn't bankable. Yeah, there's your sexism. As a result, Jodie Foster was given the part due to her passion for the role.
I had read some articles where she had called Ted Talley and she was like, oh, I like your work as a playwright and a screenwriter. And she's like, maybe you'll write something for me one day. And he was just like, well, I'm kind of writing something for you now, because he envisioned her for that role. And she said, I know you are. She wanted that shit.
Yeah, she really did. Sean Connery was the first choice to play Hannibal Lecter.
What?
Hello, Clarice. I don't love in slices.
I had the transsexual and shy Miss Moneypenny.
Fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Oh, it's terrible. Oh, my God.
Yeah. Other actors considered were, God, he never escapes us, Al Pacino.
God, for everything.
Robert De Niro. Dustin Hoffman, that could have been interesting. Derek Jacobi, that would have been interesting.
Who is that? He's giving me a look, y'all.
You don't know who Derek Jacobi is?
I don't.
And Daniel Day-Lewis.
Oh, that's weird to me, too.
Yeah. So Anthony Hopkins famously won his Best Actor Oscar for his portrayal of Hannibal Lecter, even though the character was only on screen for just over, quote-unquote, 16 minutes in the film. We've already touched on this a little bit. However, the number is probably false, as I've seen it, at least one report that lists the screen time as exactly 24 minutes and 52 seconds. And that might actually be including like the stunt work, though, because I was trying to notice that while I was watching this, and I felt like a lot of the of shots of him, especially as he's escaping and doing all that stuff, is not really him. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if I can find out what the number actually is, but apparently it's actually the second shortest amount of time. And I did not write down the first, but it's some movie from the 50s.
For a male actor? Because I thought that
Best Actor.
The actual Best Actor, because I know, I think the shortest amount of time for a performance to win either supporting or anything was Judi Dench from Shakespeare in Love.
Shakespeare in Love. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Sir Anthony Hopkins improvised the fast slurping type sound that Hannibal Lecter does. He did it spontaneously during filming, and everyone thought it was great. Jonathan Demme became annoyed with it after a while, after a lot of takes, but denied his irritation.
I mean, how could you? I mean, my God, it's so iconic now.
Yeah. The pattern on the moth's back in the iconic movie poster is not the natural pattern of the death's head hawk moth. In fact, it is Salvador Dali's In Voluptuous Moors, which is a picture of 7 naked women made to look like a human skull.
I actually knew that one. Right.
Well, good for you.
I mean, I like art.
I always feel like I fail a little bit when these are things you already know, which is basically everything so far, I think, except for the actors, maybe.
There was one more I wanted to add to that list, though. I heard that Gene Hackman was sort of attached to this movie. Like, he bought the rights. Yeah, and he was going to write it and direct it and act in it. Yeah, and I don't see that at all either. But anyway, move on.
The movie contains a famous misquoted line. Most people quote Dr. Hannibal Lecter's famous "Good evening, Clarice" as "Hello, Clarice." This line did, however, appear in Hannibal in 2001 when Hannibal and Clarice speak on the phone for the first time, which was possibly put in by the writers in the movie as a inside joke in reference to the misquoting of the movie.
And I know that it's misquoted, and I misquote it still every time I say it.
Because it's great. Hello, Clarice.
Hello, Clarice. It just rolls off the tongue, right?
Good evening, Clarice.
Yes, it doesn't work as well.
Yeah. Also, did you catch George Romero's cameo? He's one of the FBI officers escorting Clarice from Hannibal's cage near the end of the film.
I've seen this movie so many times throughout my life. I first watched it when I was maybe like 12 years old or so, and I've had it on VHS, I've had it on DVD, I have it on Blu-ray now. I've seen it probably within like the 30 or 40s amount of times. I just love this movie a lot.
Yeah.
And I've never been able to clock him because I'm looking for George Romero, and I assume he does not look like George Romero.
No, and it's not an obvious cameo, and it shouldn't be. But I actually looked it up on YouTube, and there's a clip showing him, and he's in the background. He has like a wig on with a big parted brown hair wig, and he's the tallest guy. So he's in the background, and he has the glasses, though, I think. So I could tell it was him once it was, pointed out.
I think you may have to just show me, which is sad because he's like my favorite director, my biggest horror icon. So I should be able to see him in this movie.
No,
but
I did not know that Jorge was in this film, so I was happily surprised.
It was shot around Pittsburgh, right? So I mean, yeah,
it was.
And I mean, like Corman and Romero, they all come from the same ilk.
It's funny because they shot almost everything on location. They were like, okay, all this is in Pittsburgh, and then they went to West Virginia to do like the West Virginia stuff, and they were going to do the farm on Montana and actually go to Montana. But after
to do what? Like create a flashback?
Yeah. So, but after the performances by Jodie Foster and Hannibal Lecter, they decided we cannot cut away from these performances. This is incredible work. Literally after they stopped acting, the guy was like, guess we're not going to Montana.
Oh, so you're talking about that scene where they're in Tennessee and she's describing that night with the lambs,
they're in
right?
Memphis, and she's
you're right.
Incredible monologue and like dialogue back and forth where you're hanging on every line. Yeah,
and that's like the one time that she's looking so like straight to the camera too.
So well acted that after they cut, they were basically like, "Guess we're not going to Montana," and so they were basically able to just skip that part of the movie.
And good, because that would have been a really bad choice in my opinion. That's not a good place for a flashback. I also like that. I know I've heard somewhere that in that particular scene, I've never heard it myself, but during like the conversation between them, like somebody in the background, I remember the crew like dropped a wrench or something like that.
And yes, it was at the end of that, and they kept going. She stayed in character,
right?
And they kept going, and you can actually kind of hear it in the film.
See, I can't.
And after that, they cut. She goes, "What the hell was that?"
I didn't know that part. I just know that the two things I always look for when I watch Sons of the Lambs is George Romero and to listen for that fucking drop. Because it's just all I've heard about my entire life. And I've never heard it. I've never seen him. And I need to know where these things are. So if you heard it or saw it, I need to know.
I'd hate to be the guy that drops the wrench while someone's that in it. You know,
he was fired like right away.
Oh my God. That would suck. It was probably Jorge.
Aw, Jorge. Well, here at the Film Flamers, we like to ask a series of questions after we watch movies, and the first of them always is Silence of the Lambs a horror film?
Yes. Obviously, for many reasons. And even Wikipedia listed as such. Hell, it won some horror awards back when Saturn was just doing horror, you know? So, obviously, I mean, it has a lot of that horror gore that you would expect. You know, and you see that in some crime thrillers anyway, but there's definitely aspects to this that's horror. I mean, it gets slasher at the end when he turns off the lights. There's just so many elements to this that are horror esque or straight up horror or horror adjacent. You know, she's alone in the storage unit looking for things, you know, all of that is just classic horror movie.
It is.
It's just straight up. And, you know, the nature of Hannibal Lecter is very horror movie, you know, so it's just all ties together in this beautiful horror thriller film that it is.
And to me, I think that Silence of the Lambs is really a slasher movie without the slasher tropes or the slasher effects, right? You don't get to see all these murders. You see the after effects. You get to know the killer in a way that you would watching a slasher movie, but you get to see him more and you get to know the victims more. Yeah. And really, for me, at the end of the day, Clarice Starling is a final girl, you know? She's like the epitome of final girl. She's that studious brunette who like rises above everything. Do you think she was ever
in danger though?
Yeah, I mean, certainly at the end.
Yeah. Not from Hannibal, but
I think she was in danger mentally from Hannibal. I think that he clearly can get into people's minds very effectively. Mm-hmm. And I think that there were times, even though she was warned by all the men in her life, you know, don't do this and don't let him get in your head. I think that it happened. It happened naturally. And she was, you know, invaded in a way by Hannibal Lecter. And she was in danger all the time. And you know, physically toward the end of the movie, when we have the whole scene with the night vision goggles and the hands reaching out and she's touching and he can see his hand reaching out too. I mean, it's just like classic slasher, and she's a great final girl if you want to put her in that particular trope.
Yeah.
Were you scared watching Silence of the Lambs?
I don't view it as a particularly scary film. Maybe if I was younger and that, especially that ending scene where the lights go out and he's going after you, it's a creepy movie. That's for sure. It's a foreboding movie. It's tense.
Yes.
But I wouldn't say that that I was scared, you know. I wasn't pulling the covers tighter or anything, you know.
Now, I mean, I've said this before on this podcast, but I watched Silence of the Lambs far too early in my life, you know? I mean, like, because again, I mean, people didn't really censor what I watched, and I saw it way too early. I mean, I didn't understand what transsexuals were, you know, at the time. I didn't understand my own gayness, you know? And there are lots of themes in this movie and situations in this movie that were so different from other horror films that I had seen. And so, yeah, it affected me in quite a way when I was younger, and I was kind of scared. And I mean, now when I watch it, I don't find myself, you know, so tense, maybe because I've seen it so many times or whatever. But I can imagine like people watching this movie for the first times today or new horror fans going to discover it and them being terrified of some of these situations. I think that it's a really prime example of being able to scare you without doing the traditional things. Like, you don't have to have any violence on screen per se and just have the after effects and just have it equally as disturbing and something that really sticks into your mind.
Yeah.
So finally, and some might think most important, who's the hottest guy in Silence of the Lambs? Oh, he's thinking.
I almost wonder if they were careful about not putting any man that was attractive in this movie.
You don't think there's one?
No. There's like not a single
Can I go first then, maybe?
attractive man in this film, really.
So
not even like her dad or anything. Like,
I have a really
everyone's kind of average McPlane rap.
I have a great fondness for the singer Chris Isaak of Wicked Game fame, and he has a cameo in this movie where he plays the leader of the SWAT team that goes into the elevator when they think that Hannibal's the one like leaking the blood.
I was gonna say probably one of the cameo cops or something.
I mean, it's Chris Isaak. Chris Isaak is so hot. I think his voice is incredible. I think he's super attractive, and he's like randomly in this movie, you know. But I also think that Anthony Hopkins is like depicted in such a way, and I think that his character is presented to you in such a way that his intelligence is very sexy, you know?
Yeah, he definitely has charisma, and I like that he defends Clarice against the quote-unquote, ugly rudeness or whatever.
Yeah, Megs, yeah.
At the same time, that comes from his own psychosis, you know? So I can't imagine myself being put in a position where I was attracted to this person.
I think that, I mean, I will stand by Chris Isaak, you know, forever. But I think that Anthony Hopkins' character in this movie, if not him on his own, you know what I mean? I think Hannibal Lecter has a way to like mind fuck you a little bit, and
sure,
you know. So I mean,
and who knows? Maybe his little impromptu therapy has helped her in the long run.
Well, I guess we'll just have to like leave this one to the books, right? We can't. Scott Glenn, maybe? I don't. Anyway, this is one of those arguments that's silly to have, so it really doesn't matter, but
yeah,
who knows? Well, I think it's safe to say that the Lambs have been screaming this entire time, and it's time for us to walk away from these microphones and see if they're silent. But before we do that, we want to remind you that we want to know what you think about Silence of the Lambs. Tell us what you think about our conversation, how you feel about this movie. We know it's a classic, and we want to know why you think it is. You can do that on social media at The Film Flamers on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Or you can email us at tiredqueens@filmflamers.com or call us on our voice line at 972-666-7733.
That's right. We will take those voicemails and play them on our Shooting the Flames episodes that happen at the first of every month. Stay tuned for the rest of our anniversary month of August, because we have a very special episode coming out next week where Chris and I are going to talk about some of our favorite horror movie quotes.
That's right.
And you can bet that Silence of the Lambs is going to be all over that motherfucker.
Fuck me gently with a chainsaw.
Oh, damn, it's not on my list.
Not on mine either. We'll have that.
And guys, if you want even more Film Flamers content, head over to patreon.com/thefilmflamers, where you can find all of our bonus content. And since we're starting our new year, we're having some new segments for you. Head over and check that out. You could have even gotten this episode early for as little as $2.
Well, guys, we're tired. We need to check on those lambs. They've been screaming for quite a while.
I hope you have a nice Chianti in your kitchen, Chris. I'm a little sip.
I know I have some fava beans.
Well, on that slurp, guys, sweet dreams.
May the lambs stop screaming, Clarice.
Do your slurp one more again. Bye.